Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. And we're happy to welcome back to the program today, Oscar Gill-Lewis. Oscar, it's good to see you once again. And I'm going to ask you, for the sake of those who are meeting you for the first time, take just a moment to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, Brian. Well, it's a pleasure to be on the show again. I am an editor for Speak Freely magazine, and I'm also a political commentator and writer for Young Voices.
I'm looking at an article that you penned for Comment Central in the UK, and I have to admit, Oscar, I'm a little bit surprised. I hear a lot about reparations here in the USA. I did not realize that reparations is a topic that's on the table in the UK as well. Give me some of the background and tell me a little bit about David Lammy and some of the comments that he has made regarding reparations that are problematic.
Sure. Well, reparations, unlike the US, I guess you could imagine this as the distinction between British personalities and American personalities, that American personalities are much more out there. They'll say what they think. It's much more, not bombastic, but louder, and you know what they're thinking. Whereas in the UK, it's much more subtle. It's hidden between the lines. So you have to read into it a bit more, and we're less open to sort of saying what we think. But there are instances where people do say what they think, and we see these instances with David Lammy. So the article is about comments that David Lammy has made in the past.
Can I ask first, who is
Yes.
David Lammy? I had never
Yes.
heard of the guy before seeing your article. Who is he?
Well, excellent question. So David Lammy is now the head of the Foreign Office, which is a high office in the UK, United Kingdom. But before, he was just a Labour minister. So
Understood.
The Tories or the Conservatives were in power for 13 to 14 years. So he was just a shadow minister, and just an MP in the Labour Party, which is the centre-left party. So yes. So he made comments saying that the United Kingdom should pay reparations, especially to Caribbean nations who used to be, and some still are, territories of the United Kingdom for slavery and other issues in the past related to the British Empire, and suggested that the United Kingdom should pay reparations, financial reparations, to these countries.
Wow. And see, you'll have to forgive me because I don't know this from the UK or the British perspective, but my understanding is one of the really remarkable things is that the UK led the way in eliminating slavery, in the 19th century. In fact, they did it without having to fight a civil war in order to do so, which I thought was very exemplary. It just surprises me that the reparations question would remain for an institution that was done away with, 200 years ago nearly.
You're absolutely right. And one of the key defining factors or qualities of the British Empire over other empires, let's say the French or the Portuguese, is that when a territory wanted to leave, now I'm not saying in every case, but on average, when a territory wanted to leave, we didn't fight it. We tended to let the territory go. Obviously, that's not the case with the United States, but in most cases, that's what's happened. So I don't see this call for reparations as a connection to Britain's past necessarily, more of a left-wing Marxist ideology that's run rampant today, that believes that it's not fair that people have more money than others, and believes that just because some people are doing bad, that means that others are doing better because those people are doing poorly, which isn't the case.
Talk to me about the price tag that could be attached if this were to become an issue, and if for instance the government were to move on this. I looked at a number in your article, and 18 trillion. Where does that number come from?
Well, that's exactly right, Brian. 18 trillion has been the number that has been calculated.
Wow.
And basically, this is compensation and financial redress that's been calculated from the so-called trade that we've stolen or their goods or the 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 quality of people. So, if you can imagine that you put a price on people's labor, basically, uh, and that number has basically shot up to 18 trillion, which, as I write in the article, is more than 6 times the United Kingdom's GDP.
My goodness. Um, okay, so I have to ask this. The people who participated in the slave trade, the people whose families were, captured and who were sold and were part of the slave trade, those people have not been around for a long time. In other words, the problem was solved by people in another time. So who would benefit from this immense transfer of wealth?
Well, it's an interesting question, and it goes to your earlier question that David Lammy's critique doesn't take into account that Britain was one of the first nations to try and eliminate slavery. It's one of my main complaints against reparations is that it is so difficult to tell that you are giving the reparations to the correct people. So I'll take an example of the US for a moment, that if you give reparations to slaves, but then you can imagine that that some of those slaves that most or all of them were tended to be African Americans, that you cannot just give reparations to all black people now in America because some of them won't have aren't don't have ancestors who were African American slaves. Um, and then you can also imagine that some of those uh, African American slaves married white people, and then you have the whole problem of, well, if they're biracial, do they get half the amount of reparations? Do they get a quarter? And it's so difficult to tell who gets the what reparations. And basically, it would benefit David Lammy's constituents and get him um, political points, basically, rather than actually helping the people that he claims to be representing.
There's also the issue too of that money. It's not like a treasure chest has been around for a couple of hundred years, and we'll just dip into that and use this wealth that was created long ago. It has to be taken from people who are producing it today, and to me that seems very unjust to punish people today for decisions that were made long before they ever came on the scene, and in fact were solved before they ever arrived on the scene. But still, they would be the ones to have to pay up in order to set things right.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And if the United Kingdom were to pay these reparations, the entire country would stop to a halt, and you can imagine the pain and suffering that the United Kingdom would go through if we just had to stop all economic production to pay for these reparations. But the point isn't really it wasn't making the serious point that we have to actually pay these reparations, but it's the misunderstanding of the economics of the gain of these Caribbean nations made, and then the gains the United Kingdom made.
Interesting. Is there a way to navigate this issue without getting bogged down in, as you'd mentioned earlier, kind of Marxist dogma, which inevitably seems to come up in discussions like this?
Well, one of the things that I would recommend people look at is the facts. So that can be one of the things that can hopefully cure Marxists. But so some of the facts that I include in my article is that a lot of the economic gains the United Kingdom experience started well before the slave trade, or that the trade we had with sugar with the Caribbean nations was a small percentage of our actual trade.
Okay,
So just looking at the basic facts.
unfortunately, we're up against the clock, but this is a discussion I'm going to have to look into again. I thank you for opening my eyes to the issue. Again, we're talking with Oscar Gill-Lewis. Oscar, for people who want to follow you, where can they find your work?
It was a pleasure to be on the show, Brian. You can find me on Substack, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Speak Freely.
Great to visit with you. I look forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely, as do I.
And we are back on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome William Barclay to the show. William, this is your first time on Moving Forward, but take a moment here to tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. So I'm a political theorist and private consultant from Canada. My work's being published by a bunch of newspapers, peer-reviewed journals, like the Times of Israel, the Journal of Liberty and International Affairs, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And I'm often invited to share my insights at political forums like the University of Oxford, the European Parliament, and the UN Human Rights Council. So yeah, let's maybe leave it there.
Okay. Well, we've got quite a topic to discuss here. And as I was reading your article, which was published in the Western Standard.News, ceasefire reached in Middle East, but Jew hate continues at home. I've seen this in the U.S., and I guess Canada too is dealing with anti-Semitism that remains, even though Hamas and Israel have reached a ceasefire of sorts. Help me understand what form does that anti-Semitism take in Canada?
Oh, it takes a diverse, like so many forms, right? Like I think that just in a very simple way, like anti-Semitic hate crimes have surged by over 670% over the past year in Canada, right? And that's unimaginable. I mean, like violent anti-Semitic hate crimes have increased by 208%. As well. And we have 82% of Canada's Jewish community who now say they've been terrorized and live in abject fear within the Canadian state. I think in a very real way, like anti-Semitism across the board has been normalized, right? And the Jewish people have been rendered pretty much synonymous with the politics of the state of Israel and held violently accountable. I think that there's also this misguided belief that the ceasefire, and I think that we need to make sure to say ceasefire, not peace, right? Like I don't think there's any peace in the Middle East right now. It's just very much a ceasefire, kind of. It's a stall for now. But somehow entails peace here in North America, and that all the violent anti-Semitism that's been exposed or reared its ugly head over the past year will just go away. And it's simply not the case, right? Both sides have exposed themselves, right? And I think again, going back to it being normalized, that just doesn't go away. Neighbors don't look at each other as neighbors anymore.
When I first saw the headline, my first thought was, oh, I guess they've seen some of the campus protests like we've seen here in the U.S. But as you point out in your article, it's not just the university and college campuses where you have, particularly pro-Palestinian protesters coming out and really taking a very ugly stance against all Jews. Talk to me about some of the other places where this has been manifest in Canada.
Well, so in major cities across Canada, like Montreal, Toronto, anytime there's a pro-Israel rally or any kind of Jewish event, they're attacked by pro-Palestinian protesters and just anti-Semites, right? We've had a young Jewish woman was actually captured in Saskatchewan, kicked in the head until she was almost comatose, with a mob chanting "Death to Israel" all around her. It was like a scene out of a movie, I think just across the board in Canada, Jews and people who support the state of Israel, not even just Jews, have been denied their right to free speech. And I think that's the sad reality. It's been permitted in a lot of ways as well. And so we see that these human rights that are supposed to be so fundamental are a little bit malleable, right? And in a way, we see this like international concern for human rights, let's say, kind of ends where the Jewish community begins, right? And that's an interesting discussion to get into. It's like, why are we so happy to let this happen to the Jewish community? Because again, make no mistake, it's been allowed to happen, right? The government could have stepped in on many levels and prevented this. I think there was the Jewish community in Toronto was forced to endure, I think, over 300 protests before the police finally moved in. Like, yeah, there's something wrong here. We need to kind of prevent these people from marching through the Jewish community. But it's being permitted to happen, I think, largely because of the modern advent of identity politics, right? And how the Jewish community is eternally misrepresented as this rich, white, homogenous mass.
Well, and I think it bears mentioning, as you've just made the distinction, when we say, well, the Jews are being attacked here, we're not just talking about someone is disagreeing with them or loudly and rudely disagreeing. I mean, we're talking actual physical violence in some cases. You talk about gunshots being fired into Jewish schools and synagogues and schools across Canada being firebombed. It's interesting how polarized people are. It seems like you find very few people who are tepid on the subject of either the modern state of Israel or Jews, for that matter.
You're exactly right. And that's why I think that Canadian society can't kind of go back, and why the ceasefire in the Middle East doesn't really entail peace here, right? People have been very overt with their opinions because they felt kind of safe to do so, right? There simply hasn't been any response from the government for anti-Semitic hate crime or these protests, or even just the violent beatings that individual Jewish people have been forced to endure. In a way, it's been tolerated and encouraged. I think Trudeau himself said that he was going to arrest Netanyahu if he came to Canada, and was giving shelter to terrorist leaders, people who themselves had said that they wanted to genocide the Jewish people, right? And so it's just, I think that a lot of people in Canada now feel safe to express these views, and the Jewish community is kind of realizing that, like, they're just simply not safe here. They're very much an endangered species in a lot of ways, and I think that that's why there's been such an exodus of Jewish people from kind of, let's say, these unsafe areas.
And maybe this is the wrong question to ask, because I don't want to give the impression that, well, how can government solve this problem, as if government is the only way that it can be solved. But I'm going to ask you, what could the government be doing to help lessen this? And are there other approaches that likewise could help, bring down that pressure cooker?
So I'm going to give you a simple answer and then a little bit more of a complex answer, right? I think it's really similar to taxes, right? Whenever people talk about taxes, they bring up all these new ways to kind of make taxes fair and get people to pay their share, right? And this kind of stuff, right? But that last bit is the important point, right? I think that we have a whole bunch of extant legislation and stuff that the government just simply isn't enforcing, right? So I think that if the government wanted to make this better, right, they simply need to enforce their own laws. It's not a matter of introducing more new laws and all this kind of stuff, right? We're just simply not enforcing our existing laws, right? And so that's where it starts, right? Enforce the hate crime laws and enforce your criminal penalties. Like the protests that have been going on for over a year now are blatantly illegal, right? But they've been permitted to happen, right? I think it would be, in a way, also like unconscionable if post 9/11 you had people surrounding a mosque, right, and calling for the demise of the Muslim people therein, right? There are campaigns to prevent that exact thing from happening, right? But we're letting it happen here in Canada, in the USA, and around the world. Like it's just a weird paradox, right? Or hypocrisy, let's say. I think in terms of more complex answer, though, I think anti-Semitism is fundamentally different than kind of racism or kind of like homophobia, let's say, in that with, let's say, anti-Black racism, right? It's predicated on this notion that the Black people are somehow insufficient, right? They're too emotional and mentally deficient, whatever you want to call it, right? But with anti-Semitism, it's not that the Jewish people are deficient in any way. They're almost like too proficient, so proficient, in fact, that they're going to enslave their Gentile neighbors if they're left unrestricted in some way, right? If they're not beaten down, right? And so I think that because it's fundamentally different in this way, right? I think even you could say it's an intersectional mode of hatred, in that, like, it's not racial, it's not religious, it is intergenerational, right? It's all these different things that renders it so fundamentally different. It requires novel solutions in a way, right? And it requires kind of almost a humanization of the Jewish people, right? They need to be kind of demonstrated to be just like everybody else, suffering from problems and kind of issues of their own, right? Because I think, again, they've been misconstrued as this rich, white, homogenous mass and this monolith, right, that doesn't have any problems and visits them upon other people. And that just simply needs to change. They need to be like represented as humans again, right? I think also just with regards to this like advent of identity politics, because they've been rendered this rich, white, homogenous mass, they've also kind of almost been made de facto like the source of the problem in the Middle East, right? Because in this kind of like new age of identity politics, the rich white male is always the source of every problem in society, right? And what is the Jewish community but a rich white male to a lot of people, right? And so there's no way that they can't be responsible, right? So I think that this has to change, this monolithic kind of appraisal of the Jewish community.
And I guess the question that comes to mind here is whether government involvement, and I'm particularly talking in the form of hate crime laws, is the best approach. And I say that from the standpoint of what people think can be disagreeable. It can be obnoxious even, but if their behavior isn't violent, I think that people should be free to hold whatever point of view that they want. I think they cross that line when their actions begin to infringe upon other people or threaten or intimidate other people.
I agree with you 100%. I think free speech is of paramount importance, right? I think that there's even this notion, for instance, that you have your right to free speech in as much as it doesn't preclude anybody else from free speech, right? And I think that's where the pro-Palestinian protests kind of cross the line, and they need to be halted, let's say, because in a lot of ways, these protests and kind of the violence that's endemic to them has precluded the Jewish community in Canada from exercising its own right to free speech. And anyways, yes, I agree with you 100% on that point, that the right to free speech and kind of freedom of expression needs to remain sacrosanct.
Yep, I am all for we need to be able to find peace, real peace, and people's willingness to live and let live, and not engage in that collectivist thinking of, well, you're part of this group, so you must be this way. But this is not going to be something easily resolved, right?
No, 100%. I think this is the problem, is the Israel-Palestine conflict and everything that's kind of associated with it is all gray, right? People like to treat it as though it's black and white because it's expedient, and it allows them to kind of accomplish their own political ends, leverage it towards their own game. But in reality, it's all gray, and we need to find a way to kind of navigate that uncertainty.
Again, we're talking with William Barclay. He is a Young Voices contributor. Where can people find you on social media?
They can find me at Will Barclay, BBC, and that's on Twitter or X, I guess, nowadays. And yeah, I think we'll stick with that. I would say check me out on LinkedIn as well.
And we are back. This is segment 3 of this episode of Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Logan Calendine to the program. Logan, this is your first time joining us, so first of all, welcome. Tell us a little bit about who you are and tell us about some of the hats that you wear.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Well, I'm very excited to be here. I'm talking with you guys. I am a policy analyst. I do a lot of work from criminal justice policy to education policy, some free speech policy. In this case, I'm doing some healthcare policy because I have a lot of experience with how prohibition affects, markets. A lot of times we hope that we can control substances and prevent people from using them because they're dangerous to people's health. Unfortunately, what history and my experience working in the field has showed me is that it's a lot easier said than done.
Agreed. In fact, and when you say the word prohibition, some people will think, oh, alcohol, or maybe, dangerous illicit drugs, fentanyl or marijuana or something. But we're actually talking nicotine in this case. And I was not aware of this until I saw your article that the FDA has proposed very low nicotine standards. What does that mean when they say very low nicotine levels?
Sure. So traditional cigarettes contain about 15 milligrams of nicotine per gram of tobacco. These restrictions would lower the amount of tobacco in these cigarettes to just 0.7 milligrams or less per gram of tobacco, and that would be about a 95% decrease. This would effectively ban all cigarettes currently on the market. There's a couple low nicotine brands out there already, but they make up a very small share of the market, less than 1%. So it would be an effective prohibition on traditional cigarettes.
Wow. I'm just trying to get my head around, if they lower it by 95%, does this mean that people will be smoking much more than they would otherwise in order to, get the same nicotine fix?
That was a concern that the FDA had with this, but this would reduce the amounts so much that it would be almost impossible to continue smoking the same amount. You'd have to, if you're a pack a day smoker, you'd have to go from smoking 1 pack a day to 15 packs a day. And to a large extent, that's not feasible for cost reasons or stuff like that. The problem is less that they're going to do this. The FDA hopes that this will get them to quit, right? Because these cigarettes aren't very good. The main reason people smoke cigarettes is because they're the nicotine content, and reducing it, they're hoping that it will goad them into quitting, but more likely it will probably goad them from getting legal cigarettes to getting illegal cigarettes.
And that is a thing. I mean, you point out, there are black markets for traditional cigarettes, but this would definitely create a need that would fuel the creation of an even greater black market.
Yeah, we've seen parallels like this in the past. When a lot of people think about prohibition, they think complete alcohol ban. That's not exactly what happened with the Volstead Act of 1919. It actually just reduced or banned beverages with an alcohol content lower than 0.5%. So similar to the cigarette ban, it didn't completely ban cigarettes, just it banned this part of cigarettes that makes people want to smoke them. And as a result, individuals are likely to transfer to a black market.
Wow. Well, you point out in your article, it's not like smoking is somehow an epidemic and more people are taking it up. In fact, I think you point out that the number of people who smoke, U.S. smoking rates, for instance, have dropped, immensely.
Yeah, we are at all-time lows here. We're down 75% from 50 years ago. If we take a look at youth smoking, we're down even more than that. 20 years ago, 36% of young individuals under 30 reported having smoked a cigarette in the past week. It's down to just 6%, so a 6-fold decrease in the amount of people smoking cigarettes. And this is a large part due to the availability of alternative ways of getting nicotine, and also due to just social campaigns, some of them potentially helped by the FDA, that has made it a lot less cool to smoke cigarettes.
Interesting. I wonder if this would play into Zyn and some like the nicotine pouches and things like that. I know Robert F. Kennedy last week kind of turned a few heads when he kind of surreptitiously popped a Zyn packet into his mouth, but people want the nicotine more so than just, the yellow teeth and, stuff in their lungs.
Yeah, and that wouldn't be too bad of an outcome, if individuals started switching to Zyn. And there will be some individuals switching to Zyn, which would be an improvement because the harmful parts of cigarettes isn't the nicotine, it is the tar and other toxic chemicals you get while smoking. So other products that contain nicotine, such as Zyn, certain vapes, stuff like that, are significantly healthier and do improve health outcomes. However, not everyone is going to switch to those, less harmful substances. A large portion of individuals, they've smoked cigarettes their entire life. They're going to continue smoking cigarettes. They're, it's easy to imagine someone my age maybe switching to Zyn for blue collar workers in their 40s, 50s. I think it's unrealistic to expect them to switch away from something that they've been doing their entire lives.
Well, and I'm curious, as you had mentioned in your article, and you've mentioned again here, with the smoking rates decreasing as much as they have, I don't know that. I guess I'm curious. What worked? What is it that has helped bring those smoking rates to this 95% decrease?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have found it less cool to smoke cigarettes. There have been a bunch of public interest campaigns. There have been a lot of efforts to ensure that youth individuals don't have access to cigarettes. A lot of these would actually be undermined by a prohibition system where illegal dealers are unlikely to check IDs to make sure that the individuals they're selling cigarettes to are above age. So a lot of stricter enforcement of some of these standards has led to a decrease in youth smoking rates that could probably be overturned by this prohibition.
And there are other issues that come up. If you have to turn to the black market, the nicotine levels. I'm not trying to make the case that, boy, we should all, be smoking, good, laboratory tested stuff, but at least stuff that is currently available through these legal sources, you have a good idea of what you're getting. But when it's on the black market, that becomes much more of a question.
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen this a lot with drug prohibition. A lot of the drug overdoses we see aren't from people taking the drugs that they think they're taking. They're from taking drugs that are laced with fentanyl or laced with these other substances that are harmful. So I'm not saying that we're going to be seeing fentanyl-laced cigarettes or anything like that. However, we are going to be seeing cigarettes produced in a manner that's probably less safe, and smokers of cigarettes will have a lot less redress to address potential harms caused to them by these cigarettes because it's hard to track the producer of these cigarettes in the black market. There's no accountability there. So you are completely right that it could increase the amount of harm done by these cigarettes.
So, Logan, I'm not trying to put this all on your shoulders, but I would love to hear some of the options that the FDA might consider ahead of this particular proposal for the very low nicotine standard cigarettes. Are there other things that they could do which have worked elsewhere or that haven't been tried?
Yeah, well, as we were talking about, a lot of these products that contain nicotine but don't have the harmful substances that cigarettes have are actually blocked by the FDA, or at least restricted by the FDA to make it harder. A lot of times recently we have seen them trying to enact standards to reduce vaping and access to vaping, which is a harm reduction alternative to cigarettes, rather than trying to stop all forms of nicotine consumption, which is unfeasible. It's an addictive substance that people want. People are going to find a way to access it. We should be ensuring that they have avenues of accessing the nicotine that they are interested in having without the toxic chemicals contained in cigarette smoke.
Interestingly enough, and I've talked to a lot of people who are smokers who weaned themselves off of cigarettes through vaping, but people who don't smoke, for some reason, they tend to look at vaping as, oh, that's worse for you than smoking. And I'm like, really? Where did you hear that?
Yeah, a lot of that is a lot of propaganda from the cigarette companies themselves. They want they're not allowed to say, hey, this is actually helpful. These don't cause cancer. So what they try to do is take a look at their competitors and say, these are just as harmful, when the evidence just doesn't back that up. They're not as harmful. They don't have the same carcinogenic effects. And it's really a shame that the federal government, rather than, shedding a light on those lies, continues to try forms of prohibition and tries to stop these alternative methods of nicotine intake.
Well, and I think you are spot on for highlighting prohibition is prohibition, whether it's for alcohol or something else. And there always seem to be unintended consequences that follow when it's enacted. Logan, first of all, we're talking with Logan Calendine, who's a contributor to Young Voices. Where can people find you on social media? Where can they follow your work?
Yeah, I'm on X, formerly known as Twitter. You can follow me at Unlikely Logan. I like to give some personal takes out there, some pop political takes, and so I hope to see you all there. And thanks for having me here, Brian. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you so much. And we are back. This is our fourth and final segment of Moving Forward with Young Voices today. I'm happy to welcome Brian Nuckols. He is a Young Voices contributor. And Brian, I know a lot of people are meeting you for the very first time. Take a few moments and tell us just a little bit about yourself and about your background.
Absolutely, Brian. First of all, thanks so much for having me. I'm Brian Nuckols. I'm a contributor at Young Voices and a journalist based out of Miami. I like to write about psychedelics, harm reduction, and health policy in particular. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
I am too. When I got the link to a tweet that you had sent out about Meta has walked back its fact checking, and now there are people who are fearful. Oh no, this means misinformation is going to get through. But you spoke a truth that just resonated with me, and that is you don't need big tech to fact check for you. Let's talk a little bit about this. There was a time where we really didn't have fact checkers. When did this become fashionable? Was it during the pandemic that we saw fact checking really kind of come into its own?
It's a great question. It definitely accelerated during the pandemic, but I think it started becoming extremely prevalent during the Trump administration in the first election. I think that's when we saw the social media sites really pushing hard for this kind of fact checking.
So you have some very specific ideas and some techniques that people can use to where essentially they can become their own fact checkers and not have to depend on somebody else or some algorithm to do it for them. Where do you begin a journey like that?
Yeah, I got really interested about this discourse. Twitter rolled out community notes and then this story with Meta cutting back fact checking. It was just kind of percolating in my mind. I became very curious about it. And I just started doing a deep dive into the beginnings of this kind of practice and how misinformation and how influence peddlers and yellow journalism really spreads. Like, what are the vulnerabilities and what's kind of the root cause of it? I got really curious about that and wanted to dig in further.
So I love that I'm looking at a headline here, Radio Fake Scares Nation. This is from 1938, but it's a wonderful object lesson. Talk to me about the War of the Worlds broadcast and what we can learn from that in terms of how we can be manipulated.
It's a really good example. The cognitive bias that this really played on is emotional reasoning. And so once we start feeling emotional, fear, anger, etc., we're much more malleable and persuadable when it comes to information. It kind of shuts down our critical thinking faculties. And the fear of an alien invasion just really put people at this time into a kind of panic. And they started, they became very susceptible to this kind of bandwagon effect.
So when I'm reading a headline, for instance, and suddenly I'm having a strong emotional reaction to it, what should I do next?
Yeah, this is in the thread, I offer a number of strategies that we can use, but I think it really comes down to pausing and allowing the critical thinking faculties to come back online, kind of recognizing like, oh, this makes me angry, I'm upset. And then finding your own way to kind of slow down and think of the different angles. I personally like to use empathy, this person who I'm not agreeing with. What are they trying to do with this? That kind of helps me separate from my emotional experience. But yeah, pausing and thinking, how can I bring my kind of better critical thinking to the table here?
I like that. And I'll share an example with you. 30 years ago, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols blew up the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. And I remember very clearly a newspaper picture that came out a couple of days later showing a firefighter carrying the little bloody, broken body of a little 1-year-old girl out of that wreckage. And boy, I had a 1-year-old daughter at the time, and it hit me just like a ton of bricks. But every time I saw that, I would have a similar just, whoa, feel like I'd been punched in the stomach. And there came a point where I finally went, okay, someone is trying to make me feel very upset, either filled with grief or anger or all of the above. And it turns out, that was kind of the front piece for what became a smear campaign against not just the people involved in that atrocity, but the entire political right was basically wrapped up in the whole same ball of wax with them and said, well, these are the people responsible.
Absolutely. It's an excellent example. And we've really seen that trend accelerate. We have mass shootings and different events that are really utilized, taking that, preying on emotional reasoning and trying to scapegoat different groups like responsible gun owners and other folks on the right, especially. We're seeing a lot of that. So I think it's a really, really good example, the Oklahoma City case study.
Your Twitter thread also points out there's a reason that emotional, things that grab us emotionally are used because they work.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a very effective tactic. It's a playbook that we've seen in many, many different ideologies use it, different state and now non-state actors, marketers, all types of people are utilizing these tactics. And yeah, they're effective.
And something else you mentioned here, and I thought this was really cool, because a lot of what you're directing people to do here is know yourself. Recognize, when your chain is being pulled and when you're reacting emotionally to something. Confirmation bias, though, you mentioned that, and that is not so easy to recognize.
It's quite difficult. It's a big challenge. I think of it as almost like a spiritual practice or discipline. Like I said, I mentioned empathy. I think that's very, very important. Even when I strongly disagree with someone, I want to kind of know what their world is like, what's their worldview. But yeah, when we feel that it's dangerous or scary or dumb, just plain dumb, it's really, really hard to connect with that. And we see, especially in the social media algorithms, we can be put into echo chambers. And it takes a discipline to find the smartest person or a smart person with a completely opposing view.
Yeah, and look, I'm sure I get a dopamine release when I find somebody whose opinion seems to verify my own. It's like, well, see, I'm a pretty smart guy after all. But you're cautioning people, don't be so quick to embrace stuff. In fact, there's a question you pose here that I thought was just golden, and that is, when you hear something that sounds good, ask yourself, what would change my mind?
Yeah, for me, it's a poignant and profound question because thinking about and reflecting on the kind of evidence and the kind of experiences that that make up our viewpoints, and then thinking like, could my mind be changed on this? It's kind of a powerful practice. And for some things that are core to our worldview, it would be very hard to change. But even going through that thought experiment, and one motto I like to use, if it's true, it can take the pressure.
Very, very smart. Now, you also point to authority bias, and I think we saw this a lot during the pandemic. Well, now, this person in authority said this, so therefore, you really should believe it, or you shouldn't question it, or whatever. How do we handle when experts or other people in authority positions are saying something that we're not quite sure is true? How do you go about not being swept along with the current?
I think it's a great question. And pivoting back to what we talked about earlier, 9 out of 10 dentists recommend commercials with lab coats, again, a playbook and a tactic that is very effective.
Yep.
My question is, when I'm seeing this kind of authority bias come in, it's just like, what's their evidence? These people are smart, they're trained, but the methodology is typically not mystified. You can say, wait a second, they have a 20% confidence in this, or this has only been one study that's ever done. And, this methodology it doesn't seem compelling to me. That's something a layman can definitely participate in, critique. I mean, we should be humble, but also look at it. And another thing I'd say is scientists have minority opinions. Like, who has the minority opinion and what are they saying? That's another thing I like to do with authority bias.
Yeah, there's so much more in this tweet thread where you talk about how to build your own fact checking muscles. First of all, let's ask, where can people find you on X, and how can they follow you?
Yeah, find me on X. I love to be social and talk to people. I'm at my name, Brian Nuckols, 13, my favorite number. And come find me, y'all.
Okay, I wish we had more time because this is a conversation that I think more people need to hear. Again, talking with Brian Nuckols. He is a Young Voices contributor. Brian, looking forward to our next conversation.
Me too, Brian. You have a great day, and thanks for having me on.